What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to the Homebrewed Christianity podcast, where we bring you the most zesty, nerdy, theological ingredients for you to brew your own faith. That's right, we don't want to think for you. We want to think with you. And today on the podcast, you're getting number 7 of 8 God Pods. That's right, the Unfolding Theology series on God. Number 7 with Keller. And we're going to talk about theopoetics, God-ish talk, some post-structural, feminist, eco-spiritual, mystical, cosmologically all quantum entangled thought. Yeah, except when she says it, it's way cooler. Anyway, Keller, she's on the podcast. She's going to be talking, and we're going to talk about God. Not only that, but at the very end, she's going to say a little something about upcoming event at Drew School of Theology. They're having a special conference, and she puts together these interdisciplinary conferences that are like taking kind of like theological interests and then these different disciplines all across humanity, social sciences, and this one's on affect theory, connecting with theology. It's an amazing conference. She's going to talk about it at the end, but you can also see links to it and information on the website. So after you hear her talk about it at the end, then say to yourself, I want to find out about this thing that's going on at Drew. Because Drew Theological Seminary, one of our sponsors for the podcast, that's right, they are having this amazing conference. So if you want to go out there and check out the seminary, you should also go out during the conference so you can have some process encountering affect theory and feminist queer thought all exploding right there on Drew's campus. Boom. And when you go, make sure you talk to Steve. Steve's the recruiter for the seminary, and then say, like, look, I'm coming out to the affect theory thing because I love Keller and I want to nerd out, but I'm thinking about going to school there, and so you should take me to dinner and talk to me about it. And then Steve would be like, that's great. Who doesn't want to have more homebrewed Christianity deacons at Drew? See? Boom. You're welcome. That's right. Tell Steve I sent you. It'd be great. Also, a couple other goodies headed your way. March 31st, we are going to be hosting Homebrewed Christianity, tag teaming up with Claremont School of Theology, the kickoff, the interfaith launching of National Geographic's new 6-part miniseries, The Story of God, with Morgan Freeman. That's right, it is a 6-week travel documentary around the world and all the different historic wisdom, traditions, and religions, examining the big human questions like creation, evil, afterlife, all that kind of stuff. And it involves Morgan Freeman doing it and traveling around the world. It's visually rich. It's informationally rich. You get abstract thoughts from the world's religions, seeing it embodied in practices. And you don't get it like, oh, here's an introduction to this religion, here's an intro to this. Instead, what they do is hook it together around these deep questions that human beings have been asking forever. About meaning, purpose, value, depth, continued existence, afterlife, all that kind of stuff. And that Story of God with Morgan Freeman on National Geographic, the kind of kickoff release thing we're doing at Claremont, is March 31st. You can go to homebrewedchristianity.com. You'll end up finding out more details. You can go on the Facebook and type it in. There's going to be an event page and stuff there. Or just plan to come to Mud Theater if you're in Los Angeles. And it starts at 7. It's going to have a huge interfaith panel. Some of the producers are going to be there. You know, I met them, interviewed them already. Story of God, Morgan Freeman, National Geographic. They're going to be there. We're going to be able to have an interfaith panel. Philip Clayton and I are going to be there, hosting, putting this junk together. You're going to be able to hear, after seeing an episode, talk to the producers, then have a conversation with like a Buddhist, a Jain, a Jew, a Muslim, church leader in Los Angeles, faith church leader in Los Angeles, all talking about how we explore these questions in a pluralistic interfaith environment today. That's right. 3 things. You get to see the premiere. You get to talk to producers. You'll have an interfaith panel, and then afterwards there'll be a little reception time where you can get some beverages and stuff. And if you're a leader of a faith community, there'll be extra resources there if you want to be able to discuss any of these things in your congregation. And I just want to tell you that because soon and very soon you'll be getting some information about the companion podcast to the National Geographic, The Story of God with Morgan Freeman. And in it, you'll find out that yours truly is putting together a companion podcast for it. And those are going to be individual episodes for each episode. You watch it, you listen to it, and it digs deeper. It also helps you think and reflect on what you saw, fills in some details, engages it, you get feedback, and also helps you think about how you could use it to, talk, discuss amongst friends, amongst fellow members of your faith community and such, or maybe even your neighbors who belong to other faith communities. All right. The last thing is I'm going to be in North Carolina in April, and it's going to be pretty amazing. I'm going to be at Myers Park Baptist Church, and Myers Park is in Charlotte, North Carolina, and they are a Baptist church that's rather progressive. They're brand new. Senior minister Ben Boswell is a friend of mine from undergrad, and he didn't even know they had invited me. And their associate minister, Faith Formation, Chrissy Tatum, but now she's Williamson because she's married, is a friend of mine from Divinity School. So, going to the kind of famous, historic, progressive Baptist church to talk about Jesus, and then find out that, not one, but two of the ministers are dear friends of mine, is just way too exciting. So April 15th to 17th is when that's going to go down. And not only can you come to that, but I'm going to get to do a podcast there in Charlotte. And guess who's going to be joining? If any of you, I know there's probably 40-some thousand of you that didn't listen to episode 6. But if you were among the elect, the few, the chosen, the proud, early participants of the Homebrewed Christianity podcast experience back in 2008, then you'll remember Anthony Smith, the postmodern Negro. He is going to be up in his house. He's one of the people that first introduced me to all the emergent conversation. I showed up at the first time I'd ever gone to any of it, and we end up in the corner having some craft beverages, talking about Richard Horsley's book, Jesus and Empire. And ever since then, he's just been a friend. I look up to him, super mature, inspiring, activist, church planner, all kinds of amazing goodness. And he's been very active in working in the Black Lives Matter movement, the Moral Monday movement in North Carolina. So we're going to get to talk about theology, race, activism on the ground, and its connections to the kind of more abstract theological thoughts. But most of all, I'm just excited that everyone that listens to podcasts that wasn't listening then is going to get to hear, after we record it, me talking to my buddy, Anthony Smith. If you're in North Carolina and you can't come to the entire thing, then come to the podcast. But you can find all the details out. I'll be putting them up on the website. But April 15th to 17th, Myers Park Baptist Church in North Cackalack. What's up? All right. Now, as we jump in to the God Pod with Catherine Keller, just prepare yourself to be blown away. I love Catherine Keller. I know you're surprised. Just Catherine. And if you are a member of the Homebrewed Community, the people that have joined the Homebrewed Community, donate every month, keep the podcast happening, popping and stuff. No, coming up next, in the month of March, we start Augustine's City of God, if you're in the book club. We're going to be doing an introduction to Augustine with the one, the only, Paul Capets. That's right. Rather amazing historical theologian, and the guy that was on the podcast the time we have still the number one episode of all time on Homebrewed Christianity is an introduction to existentialism and theology that we did a couple years back. He's going to be helping us with the introduction to Augustine and the City of God. Then in April, after we've read it, Philip Clayton and I are going to talk about the City of God. Pretty excited because Republic, Plato's Republic went awesome. Now, City of God, then we're going to make all these political, philosophical connections and stuff. Yeah. You can find out more about that. Just go to homebrewedcommunity.com. All right. Here it is. Catherine Keller.
Ours is a time of social and spiritual upheaval and a desperate need of a path toward healing and reconciliation. The Drew Theological School can set you on this path. The Drew Theological School trains leaders, scholars, activists, and pastors to be rooted in Christian tradition, innovative in spiritual reflection, and courageous in pursuing justice. Through studies in one of the 6 degree programs offered at the Drew Theological School, you will become the rooted, innovative, and courageous agent of healing and reconciliation our world so desperately needs. To apply for one of the 6 degree programs at the Drew Theological School, visit their website at www.drew.edu/theological or contact their admissions office at 973-408-3111.
Well, hello, everyone. This is the Unfolding Theology God series, and today Catherine Keller is joining us, so you may as well buckle your theological safety belt. And by that, it's probably going to get poetical. She may start talking about the incarnations. We may have a little battle for who loves John Cobb more. Anyway, Catherine, thank you for being here. Before we jump in to your kind of initial talk about God, why don't you let us know what it's like being a professor up at Drew Theological Seminary or School of Theology?
Well, it keeps this God question alive. And, that's a rather miraculous testimonial to Drew's being a vital, troublemaking, difficult, and very lovable place for me for all of these years, decades. I've been there a really long time. And that's not just because I had a psychological need to dig in and make myself at home somewhere in the world, but really, it never seemed like quite the same place. So I didn't feel like I was at the same place all of those years. It's been dynamic. Sometimes that's a euphemism. Sometimes that's a modest understatement. But it's a place where theological thinking really does happen without inhibition, and yet it does meet a lot of internal criticism and constraint and difference among us. So that's been precious, but especially the relationships that form with my students at Drew, that also unfurled for decades, has been a little taste of the kingdom of God. So that's Drew.
Yeah, and it's in Madison, New Jersey. So
yes,
if people are wondering under what geographical circumstances would they get to go to seminary with you, it's in Madison, which is one of the prettiest places, especially in the fall.
It's a sweet little town, big oak trees, but I'm sitting up on the 20th floor of an apartment building with about a teaspoon's worth of the Hudson in view. So I'm on the New York side of the line.
All right. So when we were emailing about this, the topic title you sent in was God-ish Logos of Theos in a seriously uncertain time, which is about as clear a direction statement as it gets to where this might go, with question marks and parentheses around words. So I'm sure this will be the most straightforward talk we've had thus far.
Linear, to the point.
Oh yeah, every
chaos here.
Oh yeah, all God talk has to have a real straightforward, rational teleology to it. That way we know it corresponds fully with God's self-testimony and the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So everyone, after that sarcasm, will you sit back and enjoy Catherine Keller, just Catherine Keller, JC.
Well, thank you, Tripp, for again giving me the chance to take part in this little this little basileia of a network that you're creating. It really does stun me every time. And so the assignment seemed pretty tough to me, naming the most pressing question about God that has shaped my thinking, right? So I realized, look, I have to do what I want my students when they're writing their theses or their dissertations to do, like come up with a simple statement of a through line. And that's relatively impossible always. But then I was thinking, what have other theologians perhaps named as their most pressing question about God? And, they could probably come up with something. Barth might come up with the question of the revelation of God in Christ. Tillich might come up with the question of God as the inexistent ground of existence. Moltmann might come up with God as the source of eschatological hope for the future. John Cobb, well, I think he has recently come up with the question of God as it really answered itself to him early and answers itself to him still as the reflection on the supreme calling to love God with all that I am. I think that's what he sees theology is all about, the supreme calling to love God with all that I am. That's pretty good. Those are all pretty good. But what about me? Just pumping up my feminist self-esteem to put myself in that sequence of guys. Anyway, so what I might name as the most pressing question, and I know it isn't just the way you have tried to trip me up, but it might be this. It would be that God names the almost unnameable name of a relationship to all that is. The almost unnameable name of a relationship to everything. So God appears, if God appears, as the living ecology of the universe, or as what Cusa called the relation of relations. God, though, would name that relation of all relations, the relation to all that is, as a just and loving relation to all that is. But if I had to shrink this down even more, it would be just to say the most pressing question is whether I can just name God as just love. Just love. But the name God has been under strain. This is something none of you have missed. Its justice has been betrayed or secularized. Its love has been hallmarked and valentined. The relation of just love to thinking people outside of religious institutions makes it hard. Makes it hard for us who are inside, perhaps, of religious institutions to name God as God. It makes it seem a little violent or just plain embarrassing to talk that way. And if we are in love relations to folk who don't inhabit religious institutions, this awkwardness really hurts. It really matters. It makes us stumble. It trips us up, and not always in awesome ways. So, naming God, it seems to me to only be able to happen now, honestly, within the context of a whole new kind of unnaming that is circulating through the very naming of God in this century. And fortunately, that new deconstructive unnaming of God has very constructive, indeed very ancient Christian antecedents, right? The apophatic tradition. I think a lot of people listening know what that is, so we can talk about that more later. And this unnaming of the name does perhaps let us recognize something that has changed within ourselves as Christians, or within ourselves as thoughtful theists. And frankly, the guy who wrote this book not just a smart aleck, this guy. There's so many awesome points that are made actually with genius in this little book. Jesus, Lord, Liar, Lunatic, or Awesome. And I'm just going to mention one that's sticking to me and to this point where Tripp says, Tripp, you, I'm talking to a whole lot of you, but Tripp is right big there in my screen. Tripp says that the line between atheism and theism is no longer clear and external. It runs through you and me. The line between atheism and theism is no longer clear and external. It runs through you and me. That's strong. That gives me a fresh sense of connection to what I've been struggling to name for a few years. This unnaming that is a vital part of naming God, but that can't be stopped. It can't be slowed down, and yet it names its own terms, and its unnaming unnames its own unnamings, and so there are fresh namings of God that become possible, aren't there? But this line between the inability to name God without feeling that it's just something of a lie or a lunacy, on the one hand, or the insistence that this God has to just simply be confessed and named as Lord, no questions asked, on the other. That sort of clear line isn't holding up, not for thinking people. And yet that doesn't mean that we need to then just choose between theism and atheism. That's your point. In fact, we can't just choose. The terms have shifted for articulating what those are. So, of course, the pressing question about God is always God, and the crude echo, well, is there one? God, just in case, Siliona. And yet, the problem with this question of whether there is God or whether what we call God died a while back and therefore never really lived at all, except as a very dominant symbol in a very dominant civilization. Well, that question of whether there is God can distract endlessly from the God question that actually matters, which is our relationship to everything but God, which is, I think, the question that really matters to God, not how and if we relate to God or whether we think God exists or whether we believe. No, I don't think God gives much of a damn about our theology per se, except in as much as it's bearing some fruit. And that means bearing a just, loving relationship to everything that we don't call God. And the question of whether there is God or not can just entangle us endlessly in brilliant debates about the death of God and what comes after, which I'm not shutting down, obviously. I get involved, but I don't want to get stuck there either. Because we want to be able to say God with honesty, and that means that smudged line between theism and atheism is going to sometimes just run right through the middle of our thoughts about anything else, and it'll need to be articulated again, and then perhaps left to go into some good Quaker silence, I feel, again. And then out of that good contemplative silence, we talk some more. We're talking here. we're talking some God. So my point about the omni-relationality of God is, of course, a point about entanglement. It's a point about the entanglement of God in everything that isn't God, and of everything that isn't God in God, and it's the entanglement of our God talk in all of our other talk. It's saying we can't separate God out from everything else except by a rather rude abstraction. What people in Claremont know as the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. And of course, when I was a student in Claremont and we were always trying to stage little feminist uprisings, we liked to spell fallacy with a PH. But notice I didn't name the sex or the gender of God as the most pressing question about God for me, at least in this millennium. So the question of God seems to me, right, is always a question of our construction of God. It always brings one back to doing constructive theology. I'm glad you folk have quite an event planned under that very concept. And constructive theology, of course, is always inherently deconstructive, whether it likes that Derridian word, that name, or not, and vice versa. Deconstruction is always really just recognizing our constructions as constructions. I think that's what it means to deconstruct, unless it becomes destruction. It's to recognize how very constructed our constructions are. That's an inherently deconstructive move. So recognizing that in our saying, we're making some things up. That's already to perform a bit of unsaying that might allow us to say more honestly and therefore perhaps more persuasively. It's to bear in mind that line that runs through ourselves. Seems to me that's when the very term constructive theology becomes possible in the 20th century as part of a response to radical theology, part of an engagement of the death of God theology, and this new shift in systematic thinking to an awareness that we aren't just smoothly unfolding systematic rationality about God in our best possible Wissenschaft out of a clearly revealed original truth. That we're making up a lot about God because our language is also creaturely. So am I saying that God is just made up? Am I saying that God is just a construction, just created, make believe? Maybe to say that God is love is really to say, well, then love is God. And then maybe we should just go with love. Just really get that right. Just love and let the God story go. And for all I know, God might think that's a good idea at this point. But I haven't heard that yet from God. So until she tells me otherwise, I'm going to keep constructing deconstructively. But this creating then, this constructing is, after all, a relation to all of the creation. It's not just a matter of making things up from scratch. It's not just making things up. We might be creating our images of God. Yes. But we are not creating them ex nihilo. We aren't creating our God talk out of nothing. No more than God creates the creation from nothing. We can talk about that later too. But when you invited me to do this trip, my strongest impulse for today, actually, and it stayed with me, it haunted me, was to share a dream from my childhood. And I want to do that just because I have such an impulse to do so. And I've hardly shared it publicly. it once out. So I think that I was 6. I could have been 5. I could have been 7. I don't know. When I had this dream. And there's happening what looks like a great fireworks display. And the fireworks are not looking like fireworks per se. They're looking like those pulsating yellow star shapes of Matisse's jazz paintings. Do you know those? They're very asymmetrical stars that are pulsing in a jazzy way around a black figure, very black figure, very abstract. I didn't have a figure, any kind of anthropic figure in this, just one really big gold pulsating star and several around it. I knew, in the way you know in a dream, that this was God and his angels. I'm not correcting my sexist language at age 6. God and his angels. But it was fireworks. It was a fireworks display that some group had staged. And that scene ended, and then it was the next day, and it happened again that night, the night in the dream. Again, the same display, exactly the same, kind of pulsating, jazzy, big stars, God and his angels. But this time, the dream told me it really was God and his angels. And I'm not sure that the rest is something that happened or if I made it up in waking up, but I believe that that God and his angels had come to give me the new law. And all I remember is telling my mother that the first commandment was, thou shalt not be bossed, which she didn't take very warmly. She didn't recognize a new dictum of liberation from a daughter. But that part I'm not so confident in my memory of. What I'm confident in is that first there was a human fireworks display, and then God and the angels came in just that form. So I think I was dreaming about constructive theology and about, how we do make up. We make up beautiful displays, luminous. So God isn't just good old God. This is not a dream about the old omnipotent, transcendent, self-revealing God. Is it about God just being made up then? No, that was really God that came the next day, and the angels. So actually what we made up was vivid, but it seemed to have given God the idea to appear in just that form. So it seems that God isn't merely constructed, and yet it seems that it's only through our constructions that God can actually appear, manifest, be revealed. So only through at least our better, more fireworky, jazzy constructions can God actually appear. So God is not just a projection, not just a rhetorical strategy, at least according to my childish dream. God is not just and not just God. So, Trip, what I thought I'd do is to shift us perhaps towards discussion. I think I can do this very quickly, is to suggest how this meditation on a just love that can be called God, but only with a constructive mindfulness of the entanglement of all of that naming in our own creativity. By running it through, let me run it through a kind of micro systematic theology. of a constructive sort, just to hint at how the different registers of the entangled difference in play might hold together theologically as always past, always present, and always coming. That is, as creation, incarnation, and eschaton. See, being really rational and straightforward here. So, of course, if I were doing creation, incarnation, and eschaton, I would have to enfold them all in what I may have called the cloud of the impossible, which would suggest the nonlinear space of a beginningless and an endless unfolding, explicatio, and our creativity, our unfolding would be one gifted and often rather deformed expression of that unfolding. So creation, incarnation, and eschaton, really in some way I've done these in different books. I'm just going to sketch it to see if it holds together in a kind of systemic, God-talky way. Creation, then, I believe I've argued at absurd length about the second verse of Genesis, that the best theological interpretation of the creation, at least the most biblically faithful for us at this moment, would not be creatio ex nihilo, but would be creatio ex profundis, not erasing all of the brilliant gifts of the ex nihilo tradition. But that's another question. I proposed this creation ex profundis as a way of getting at the Hebrew stories, which are never from nothing, but always of a creation out of the deep or out of the formless chaos. So out of the past of all that has already become and that has folded back in to a bottomless abyss that is then the potentiality for all of our becoming. So creation then as ex profundus would be a way of reflecting on precisely this relation to all that is as the creation unfolding even now among us. And what about then the incarnation? Well, as the specific presence of Jesus, the just loving Jew, the homeless messianic radical that Tripp's Jesus book captures so lovingly. Yeah, he is indeed freaking awesome. That's a quote. But as the single exceptional incarnation of God the Father, that Jesus got quickly de-Judaized and so discarnated. What, after all, he cared about was our relations to everyone else, right? Matthew 25, and cared about relationship to him only, really only, if it served those other relationships. It wasn't about serving him. Well, that Jesus does really belong to the deep past. Present as the Christ? Well, certainly to those of us who are Christians. But that Christ as the one and exceptional incarnation turned over and over into, Christ Incorporated, right? Christ Inc. And undid all of that splendidly, awesomely entangled relationality that had come into an intensified, loving view for a bit. So how do we keep reclaiming, nonetheless, that story of the Incarnation as present without getting it trapped and shrunk into Christ Inc. Well, okay, I just finished maybe yesterday a book called The Incarnation. It's a collection of essays. So perhaps as creation can register as creatio ex profundus, perhaps the Incarnation can register as then the intercarnation, the relationality of all matter and its mattering, the participation of all bodies in God's incarnation. But then as members, not just of a body, but, that's Corinthians, but Romans, members of each other. And if we have time, we can talk about how this intercarnation, this becoming incarnate of all things, and therefore of God in all things, has something to do with an ancient theopoetics. So then eschaton, hope always shadowed by apocalypse. Eschaton, the future, the coming now. Perhaps I have already in the last millennium tried to let eschatology then register as counter-apocalypse, not anti-apocalypse, but actually a kind of apocalyptic unveiling of its own, but that counters the determinism, the endism of dispensationalism, for instance, and of all the timelines and of all of the ways of framing creation, incarnation, and eschaton as a line that ends. So an indeterminate, risky future, but open. What's coming? Well, we don't know. And if we're any kind of process theologian, we also don't think that God knows quite what is coming, because it's up to all of us collectively. And unfortunately, us also is spelled in capitals, US, these days, all too dangerously. So I think the little book that I want to write during this sabbatical, this brief sabbatical I'm having, might be called Apocalypse After All, ? And I'll have to get back to this question of the counter-apocalypse and make sure I wasn't being too Pollyannish, make sure I gave John of Patmos his due, actually. Because the ecology of our terrestrial life is in deep doo-doo. We're really making it, as Francis said, a garbage heap. We're not composting our waste products. We're letting it turn all toxic. So don't need to go into that so much, except to say, the ecology of our entanglements, our relationships to it all, at least on this planet, will yield a new heaven and earth. Ha-shamayim vet ha-eretz. There will be a new one. Remember that in Hebrew, heaven also means atmosphere. There has become already a new atmosphere surrounding our earth. And it might not be the one we wish for. And this is all the more reason to practice our just love, isn't it? Which is not optimistic, but it is hopeful. Yeah, so are we doing a fireworks show of violence, racism, Islamophobia, not just bombs, but CO2 bursting in air? Or, my God and the angels look like wonderfully Matisse jazzy stars. It's all disturbingly up to us and to God as our relationship to all that is. I think that's a point to open into some conversation, yes?
Oh, I think so. I had some I had a number of questions that popped up. I know Phil said he was only going to ask 3 questions. And we'll see. We'll see. And you may want to judge him for picking 3. When theologians say they're only going to do 3 things, who knows what they manage to fit in it? I
just the creation, incarnation, and eschatology.
Well, yeah.
3-ish. Yeah.
Well,
Go ahead.
This is, no one wants to know what I think. Anyway, but first, there's a question that it was sent in. And it connects to what was going on. It might help tease out the methodological nods you were making to a number of different conversation partners. Tim asked, he said, I'm glad you mentioned that we're not creating our God talk simply out of nothing. How entangled is our theopoetics conception of God as loving relationality in an event-based metaphysics that is an actual claim about what's really real?
Mm-hmm. Well, great question. Who asked the question?
Tim.
Hello, Tim. Yeah, that question of the really real is a zone of its own. Apophasis, isn't it? We're always having to question, to criticize, to challenge what has been called real, and to undo every form of realism that we can then name naive realism. And that's probably what Kant needed to do, and yet we don't want to get stuck with a manual either. And if we have been brainwashed by Whiteheadians, then of course, I think that we don't escape the real, and we don't escape reflections on it, and we don't escape a kind of realism, which is something to say, because we're constructing everything. We construct what we mean by an electron. We construct what we mean by this glass of water. And so God, well, give me a break. A really big break would be best, a long silence. Okay, that's as much as I need of silence. So if we give ourselves that moment of silence, then it seems to me that we are not just self-critically, auto-deconstructively mindful of our own constructions and how very fallible and full of very nice brainwashings and some not so nice ones they are. We are aware of the giftedness of those traditions in their improvisations, very jazzy. And we are aware that we are not going to stop doing it. We're not going to stop talking about something very like God by whatever name. We're going to have to ask the questions about ultimacy, about infinity, about the dark horizon that gently surrounds everything. And I think what that meditation allows us, that attunement to the constructedness that is an apophasis allows us, is the theopoetic cataphasis, that is the eventiveness of language, its lively springiness, its poiesis comes into play. And you all know that Theo, I hope you don't all know, because I don't want to just be boring you, but that theopoetics, a term that really just started getting bandied about in the 60s. You know where first? Someplace called Drew Theological School. Really pretty much invented it. Stanley Hopper and Amos Wilder at Harvard then gave him credit for that term. I got to Drew over 20 years later and then thought I invented the term at some point, and realized, no, it was just some ghost in the hallway that had whispered it to me. And it has other traditions, and through Syracuse, where much of Drew went when Drew almost died in the late 60s. So theopoetics has its own history. I've written that up in Incarnations a bit. but it goes way back as a word to theopoiesis in the 2nd century. That's the term that then gets contracted as theosis, which we understand to be divinization, like Mr. Orthodoxy, Athanasius saying the Incarnation, right? God became human so that the human could become God. So it's the becoming divine, theopoiesis, poiesis, making, creating is what poietis is the Greek word for the creator, and then poema, the poem, is the creation. So the poetics is always dealing not just in poetry as figurative language or aesthetic wordings. It's dealing in the creativity, which is the creativity of the creation itself. And we can call the the relation of all the relations that foment the creation God, if we like, and we're naming something real. When we're talking about God, we're naming something real about the creation. We just, I think, are wanting to be very Jewishly and piously able to unpronounce that language.
Yeah. One of the things that made me think of and you talk about it in the cloud and a number of the people you even mention in it when you just start reading Cusa or Gregory of Nyssa and people that the practice of theology, when it's connected to unsaying and the practice of piety, saying less, knowing what you don't say, and unsaying and things isn't a deflationary relationship to theology. It's actually a pious one, because you're protecting the very mystery that others may want to be nailing to the wall with these real exact and logical statements. I remember Nazianzus said that you should never teach theology to someone that hasn't learned the art of contemplation. Otherwise, they'll mistake what it is they're saying when they say things about God. And I really fascinated by the return of the apophatic to essentially places where you do constructive theology for ministers. Like, why is theopoetics coming in to people that are training not just scholars of religion, but also people that walk up into pulpits, exegeting texts, being present with people in sacred times and transitions, and learning the art of liturgy and all that kind of stuff. I think there's a tendency for people to see that poetic stance first as like avoiding really wanting to say something about God, rather than creating the space for God to be present in our mumblings.
That's so much better put. Thank you. And it's crucial to just keep saying, right, this negation of negative theology is a clearing away, an opening of space. It has a quasi-dialectical, though not mechanically so, kind of oscillating power to it, that those moments, and sometimes they are just moments, aren't they, of contemplation, the moment of just a deep breath, allowing yourself to slow down, allow then the creativity to happen. They allow the language to flow again. They allow your sermon to glisten and attract a bit more powerfully. They might allow your street speech to draw in more of the crowd. You're tuning in. And I think what's really important to me, I think the obsession of the Cloud of the Impossible, the book, is that tuning in the silence isn't just a tuning in to what we call God. It's a tuning in to all that God is in relation to. It's a tuning in to the particular manifestation of everything that is before me. Right now, it's a few friendly faces on my screen right there before me. And I know that you all are entangled truly infinitely, to all the faces that we aren't looking at right now. All that just ripples out into what's unknowable, as of course depths of each of you are to me. And so that tuning in to the unknown is not just a contemplation of the mystical abyss of the divine. It's also a contemplation of the mystical abyss of the world that is between us now, always, that is is appearing in our intercarnatedness, that is in our interdependency. So yeah, we're mysterious to each other, and if we can stop in tune to that, if I am not just too sure about what you said and what you're going to say, I might respond a little bit better next time.
Mm-hmm. Well, Phil, you have your 3 questions, and I'm counting. I'm not going to judge you publicly, just on the inside.
Well, Catherine, it's great to be talking. Usually we do it over a glass of wine, so I was going to send you a bottle of wine so that
never beer,
so that you could open it. So what we really need to do is dialogue. We never lecture at each other. And so my questions, which in the meantime have multiplied to 7, like rabbits, are meant to be dialogical. They're meant to draw out questions and perspectives and possible implications of what you've said. I want to probe how we should understand and interpret you. But I needed a creative way to do that, Catherine. So I decided to do it by the book. And that is, I've been studying the titles behind you this time, the way that in my first
oh no,
we had a screen and people would tweet in their comments like, "That's an ugly sweater you're wearing, Philip," and you'd see 300 people laughing, and then you realize that something had happened behind you that you had no knowledge of. But the behind and before actually fits nicely. Oh, there's a couple more I hadn't seen. Fits nicely with your own thoughts. So it seems like a fair technique to pursue.
I'm glad my collection of murder mysteries aren't here.
That would have been much more fun. I could have had a more creative time. So if I want to parse what you've just said, I can leave it in this beautiful balance that you create between alternatives without ever trying to resolve. And probably that would make you the happiest. But then I just have to shut up, and that doesn't make me the happiest. So number 1, I see you're framed on the left and on the right by God as power. It's the only book I can see twice. Oh, no, I see another one on your whole shelf. Also, I want to point out that the only one that's used is queer ecologies. So I think that might be a problem, but we'll come back. No, I now see 3 gods in power. You can't get rid of them. It's a 3. It's a 3. Don't do it.
I'm not getting rid of it. I'm displaying it to those.
Advertising it. Yeah. So I want to say maybe in the end, it's all about the powers that are wielded by this word, powers wielded in our hands like weapons. And maybe that's the first and most fundamental thing we have to look at as we look at this language question. I also see a decolonial Judaism, to pick another author, unless you authored that one as well. And that's another form of questioning power, giving voice to the subaltern and so forth. Don't worry, Catherine, when I run out of books, I'll just make some up. Okay? So there's my question.
You're running out of
and many of our colleagues would say it's about power in the end. What do you think? But you only get, Tripp's going to time you. You only get less than a minute because I have so many books to go through. 27, actually.
Right. Well, you perhaps deliberately misread the title of my book first and called it God as Power, whereas it is God and Power.
Yes, I meant and. Sorry.
I know that's what you meant, but it's one of those one of those perhaps Pannenbergian slips. But I am tempted to always line up God as love versus God as power, really to take down the Deus omnipotens, who I think is minimally biblical and even even less ethical, in effect. But that's a particular classical omnipotence that the question of theodicy that preoccupies my students addresses very well from a process point of view. So within this minute, let me just say, I don't want to do that anymore. I don't do that anymore, pit God as love against God as power, though clearly power didn't figure in my opening definition of just love. But to make love happen with justice takes some power.
Okay,
So,
I want to actually go in a different direction. I want to ask about the word God and its use in the hands of people, and whether the God and power might be read as the use of the word God as power. That's my slip. And one could parse what you said as giving us this Gleichgewicht, this equal weight of the both sides, the saying and the unsaying of God, so that we turn to relations of power as the really interesting and important area where we move from the Gleichgewicht into the action in the world.
No, I think that's lovely, and that equilibrium, that Gleichgewicht, is always going to get broken, isn't it? It'll slosh about, but of course, I resort to the language of God also in order to exercise some power, some influence in communities where that word is a power word, for good and for ill. So it remains all the more important to deconstruct the model of power as dominance, as indeed a unilateral omnipotence, and to keep shifting to what would be actually a fully faithful notion of God's power as love, the power of love. And I would think that then this Gleichgewicht, this at best rhythmic equilibrium that you're suggesting between the apophasis and the cataphasis, or the unsaying and the theopoetic saying, would be a way of making sure that we don't use that power language as a weapon.
Good. The second question is like unto the first. It's prompted by the book behind you, God That Matters. Pun intended, I presume. And it's a question related to the first because it asks whether your language actually turns us back to a sort of pragmatism with a no built into, with a no facing toward metaphysics, like the flaming wall that kept Adam and Eve out of the garden. Doesn't that turn us to a deeper, more profound, profundus action in the world? Pragmatism, in short. As, for example, Neville has in some ways pursued.
Oh, surely. I mean, the pragma, the doing, is, I would think, what God is trying to do with us, and perhaps even to do with us through our God talk. I mean, I'm presuming at some illicit level that God doesn't just matter to us who are still, kind of embarrassingly theological folk, but that God really matters, and that means that God is always materializing. That's the incarnation, that God is materializing in different ways and degrees everywhere, and at all times. That's the universe as God's growing and really growing body, isn't it, in this expanding universe? And that God is seeking that experience of materialization, but through the maximum freedom that evolution can bring about in the creature, so that it's really an adventure, and perhaps therefore that fiery wall is getting violated by such claims that are now, getting shored up a little bit inadvertently as far as their theological implications are concerned, but meaningfully by what's called the new materialism, Karen Barad's marvelous work, which you helped to unpack at a conference at Drew on the entangled universe, on mattering all the way down.
Beautiful. That's a beautiful answer. This next topic is probably the most crucial of anything you covered now. It's about the unspeaking and the re-speaking. And one is pulled in that direction by the most visible book on your entire shelf, the Oxford English Dictionary. Because in the unspeaking, way too many words, and the re-speaking, which is what OED is all about, and also in your own style of creatively unspeaking and re-speaking in your very text and style. But the OED is supported by other visible books on the mystery from a broken web. And the one that I love the most, it's upside down, perhaps symbolically, über das Geheimnis, concerning the secret. So I wonder how to understand. In other words, I'm probing really the Gleichgewicht more carefully, the alleged balance. And I sometimes when I read you, then I think that the unsaying wins. I think rarely do I think that the saying of God wins, but the re-speaking of God might be the most fundamental. So probing the Gleichgewicht, is it actually gleich? Is it totally equal? Or maybe each is stronger in a different way? It's my most passionate question about you today, about your thought.
Well, your thoughts are more interesting to me on that than mine are. Your thoughts on even what I'm trying to do would be more interesting to me than my thoughts on my thoughts. But so, Philip, I think it can't be a balance. It would have gotten frozen. It would have been a calculated, measured strategy of unsaying in order to say again. And that comes too close to, God's a mystery. Trust us and just do what we say. I mean, this is I worry. I worry, perhaps even in my own thinking about becoming too canny, too strategic in that unsaying. I'm always worried about the strategic calculations of the saying. That's out there and overt. But I also would worry about always trying to balance in some way. The balancing wouldn't seem so much like an equality. It would seem more like breathing, just.
Nice. Yeah, or that's your rhythmic a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
I'm tempted.
And it's the unfolding and the unfolding.
I'm tempted by two different ways to understand this unspeaking, re-speaking. The one would be that the more we unspeak the divine, the more that it sort of recedes away from us, the more that we're freed to speak. Mm-hmm. If we were confronted by an omnipotent being, we would not only be silent, we would cease to be agents. Indeed, we would cease to exist. As the German idealists point out, there would be no space outside of that one, no separate role at all. So the one is God, this is a funny way to put it, God must decrease in sayability that we may increase. The other way that tempts me to interpret that approach is to say that that we appropriate the language of God, that we do make it ours, that therefore brings God close. The danger of our politically misusing God language, as we might find in at least one of the parties in today's politics in the U.S., the misusing of God's language could then be controlled by the very parameters that you've emphasized, the love, the justice, those two in particular, but maybe others as well. Are you pulled to the one option more than the other, or a completely third way?
I'm pulled to the option of working through the first two options. Right. So, what seems crucial to me that you're saying is that is that it appears as though God's power must decrease in order that our power increase, responsibly speaking. And this was Feuerbach really needed to get God out of the way so that human beings could begin to behave in more godly ways. And there is surely some real truth in that, but it's an already warped truth that has had to answer to the warping of God into power language. That is, when God is really fundamentally about controlling power, then of course we have to back God off and finally out of the picture in order to exercise power of our own. But that's a zero-sum game. And of course, then the power we have exercised since Feuerbach hasn't been particularly impressive, at least in terms of just love. So what's really at stake, it seems to me, isn't so far from where you would probably go with a third option, I think, which is to reinterpret that power as the kind of presence that isn't controlling, that's utterly vulnerable in its ubiquity. So it's not about getting God out of our face and finally out of the picture so that we can be free. It's about recognizing God's just already there, getting not just nailed on a cross, but getting shot by yet another policeman, getting lost at sea in the boats of immigrants trying to escape the unbearable. As God's terribly vulnerably everywhere, not controlling, but mattering, experiencing materiality. And my hope is that this intuition could inspire more responsible deployment of our power that is more cooperative, love, justice, huh?
That's beautifully put. That's beautifully put. The comments are pouring in, so I will simply read a batch of my questions and then pose the last one. On unspeaking, re-speaking, I was going to ask you about the razor's edge, Mom intended. In honor of your book, Beyond Monotheism, I was going to probe divine action in this perspective. In honor of the Eco-Theology book and another book called Sacred Longings, I was going to probe emotion and ecological action. Oh, I wanted to add under ecology, ask the beasts, which would have prompted some interesting questions. In honor of biblical authority or non-authority or biblical unsaying, I have been looking at the Bible in theory, I think it is. But finally, and I have no book for this because this is the question of silence. I wonder if there is, at the end, the deepest point of contact between our two theologies and practices is the contact of participation in and with the divine. Obviously, for a Quaker, and there's another Quaker on the call, actually, to sit in silence is in an interesting way to participate with the divine, to breathe with the divine, and to stand up and to share a message is not the prophecy of the Pentecostal charismatic for whom it's a direct speaking of God's words, but it is to find language which seeks to participate in a divine message, and each person takes it on to the extent it's helpful and lets it pass to the extent that it's not helpful to her. A beautiful sense of this razor's edge of saying and unsaying, participating, knowing God and not knowing whether one knows God at all. What do you think? That's my last comment.
Well, I think, amen, brother. And there's no better noun than participation for getting at the activity of the interrelation that we sometimes call panentheism, that I'm trying to meditate on intercarnationally at the moment. Participation suggests the radical democracy of involvement. One thinks of a participatory assembly where all the voices have voice. They have a say. Of course, there's another book up here somewhere on its back called Organic Marxism.
Hey, there you go.
And participation might take a more socialist form as it reaches into a broader collectivity and a rigorous engagement of human and non-human systems. But to in silence become aware of our participation in the divine and the divine's taking part in us is to remember that we're just parts in an all that is endless, but we really are part of God, and God really is part of you, part of me, and needing our voices. I think there's some motivating energy that arises at that razor's edge of saying and unsaying.
Beautiful. Well, may the conversation continue. It's not an end, but a beginning. Trip, back to you.
All right. Well, we're getting so many questions. I think I'm just going to ask a few of them before asking some of the things that popped in my head, because they will just be nowhere near what the questions were sent in. But Khaled, who the other Quaker on here, asked,
Khaled, hi.
If there's not a balance as such, and this is in the language conversation you were just having, what is the derivative ethical mandate following from this moving theological telos? Does ethics shift in parallel as well? And then, because everyone knows isomorphically, how does that fluctuating on language end up impacting the way theology functions ethically?
Well, I think that, Khaled, you're the one to lay that out for us. You've been doing it. Your reader on theopoetics is profoundly motivated by the question of ethics. And I don't think you're ever working for a mere balance between silence and speech. I think you're working for a rigorous embodiment of our speech in our actions, an embodiment that won't happen without the self-critical and the mystically creative silence. I'm going to try to stay brief like this, but if I'm failing to answer a question, you just come and push back at me, okay, Trip?
Oh, yeah. Another question was, I wonder how the gospel accounts of the Messiah Jesus' silence before the questioning authorities, derision, and accusation fit into this discussion at the intersection of politics and God talk.
Oh, that's interesting, right? The silence of someone who knows that that he's screwed. I mean, whatever he says will be used against him. The silence of someone who doesn't want to cast his pearls before a very Swainy Caesarean presence. Yeah. So there are many, many kinds and forms of silence, and only sometimes is that silence a kind of lovely Quaker or mystical meditative silence. Sometimes one is getting silence. Sometimes one is choosing to withhold speech because it has no chance. I think that's what we're experiencing with Jesus there, and that whatever he says might get just used in some way that makes a mockery of the whole movement.
Well, and one of the things you said earlier in talking about the Incarnation is that the church and its Justinian editors to the theology, when it goes Christ Inc. on us, turned Christ into the exception, and in doing so undoes the actual entanglement that Jesus, as one who makes present and brings in the kingdom of God, brought about. In one sense, the silence serves as a way of not giving the opportunity for them to treat him as the exception, as if what he is making present in his own ministry is somehow eliminatable by eliminating his body, because it's precisely in the crucifixion of his body that community is brought into a pneumatological entanglement, which is the church. And that kind of that the body of Christ is no longer to be identified with the one who stood judged, but I mean, if you just in the New Testament, Jesus is like identifies with the least of these, identifies with community in which you share life together, where 2 or 3 are gathered, identifies with the basic eating and sharing of wine with friends and that kind of thing. And so, to me, I think there is that sense that the moment you isolate the good news into a beginning and ended person, as if the incarnation was a divine invasion, then it can be squelched, covered up, or monetized and turned into a market. The silence, I think, insists against that.
Yes. That's a fabulous line of thinking, Trip. So I'll just underscore that I'm preoccupied right now with the question arising from political theology and the engagement with Carl Schmitt, in the whole sense that sovereign is he who decides in the exception, right? That helped Schmitt to support the charismatic figure of Hitler as the sovereign exception, and that whole argument for the power of the exception as the one who can choose when to make an exception and have another or not, who chooses who can live and who can die, who chooses when to obey the rules and when to make the rules and when to break them. That exceptionalist sovereign power seems to me to have then, yes, funded the interpretation of the Incarnation as the great Christological exceptionalism, and it's really revealing to me to think with you then about Jesus already in some sense intuiting that risk of the idolizing and the rendering the supreme exception of his body, the exceptional criminal by Pilate, or then later the exceptional embodiment of God on earth by his later Caesar-like followers. So yes, the point here is that Whitehead can help us quite a bit with that interesting shift from God understood as the supreme exception to God as the supreme exemplification. And if we can even understand God that way, as the exemplification of, in his case, the metaphysical categories of relationality and becoming, rather than the exception to process, then all the more can we understand Jesus as the Christ, and therefore as God incarnate, as precisely the divine exemplar. That's a very traditional metaphor, but as one who has to cast his bread on the waters, who has to go black or go silent, particular moment in order for that spirit to come. And that is precisely not to say that he chose to die.
Yeah. One of the things that connected to kind of the emphasis on poetics that we've talked about thus far is on the mystery. When you start to talk about Jesus and the kingdom of God, you focus on the notion of parable as a way of understanding the poetical import of Christology. Can you say a bit about that? That might help enrich the conversation around incarnation with the performative parabolic nature of Jesus the Jew.
Yes, I loved how Dominic Crossan offered Jesus not just as the parabler, the master of the literary genre of the parable, but the parable. So the parabler becomes parable. And so I went with that on the mystery, reflecting about how then Jesus as Christ is a parable of God. And perhaps that's a way of tuning his language in the parables into the project of theopoetics, Khaled. That is, the parables themselves are intensely poetic in the literary sense, but they're depicting a poiesis in the universe that's delicate in the way that poetry is and dogmatic prose is not. The delicacy of that mustard seed, that seed that falls where the delicacy of the discovery of that lost treasure or the investment by the poor woman of her drachma, so that there's a poiesis, a making that is as parable of the kingdom, very much a making divine. It's a making of a shared divine space, the space of the kingdom of God, in which we indwell the divine. And so, yes, the parables are both theopoetics and all theopoetic as genre, but already teaching the practice of a deep God creating theopoiesis.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I wondered and you mentioned it in your micro-systematic theology, when you kind of talked about creation and this continuous creation, and that the role of creation as our past and the continuous creation of any moment is, in a sense, all that has already become, and we're receiving consciously or not, in a sense, prehending. And then you talk about the incarnation as not just the isolated person, but the living body of the Christ, or creative transformation, where that has a lot to do with the possibilities of lovey, justicey, interrelated embodiment in a particular becoming, and that eschaton functions much more like the prophetic judgment and opening up of the future in any moment. The way I heard it as like creation, incarnation, and eschaton is, in a sense, taking those doctrines then to unpack theologically all that is going on and being gifted to us, in a sense, in each moment of existence.
Right. All that's going on, right, at each moment has its alpha and omega, if the alpha and the omega are revealed as one. It's not that there then will have been no future and never was that past. It's not an elimination of temporality that's meant by the entanglement of the alpha and the omega. I think it's precisely that at every moment, everywhere, anywhere, there's creation happening, and that creativity is taking the form of a materialization, by which I mean an intercarnation, that is a relational embodiment. And Whitehead's phrase, there's the perpetual perishing. Each thing that becomes is dying into its future, and theologically understood, it's being caught up in a context in which it registers some ultimacy. So yes, I think it's always happening in every microcosm, and we can barely keep conscious of just just a few little mustard seeds of a whole universe of these seedy moments of becoming. And yet we do train ourselves with the help of that prophetic eschatological tradition to think somewhat systemically, so we don't just get lost in the myriad of the micro moments. Mm-hmm. So we think also about the way they are collected, the way they are assembled.
Well, because I think if you just heard the word doctrine of creation, incarnation, eschaton, if those are macro doctrines, they have nothing to do with us. God made the world out of nothing some other time. Incarnation, divine invasion. Eschaton, when God gets bored and finally fixes things or comes to kick ass. When it's a micro systematic theology, and I know you didn't mean it this way, but then in a sense, you are enfolding these doctrines into the very moment of living, using the theological history, saying and unsaying, to unpack our inheritance, our responsibility, and the possibilities that are before us in each moment. You're enfolding the exceptions that these doctrines have served through a lot of church history as the kind of the poetic material that calls the Christian community forth to live with integrity in the entangled world we live in. And anyway, that was, I thought, oh, that's neat, because so this is why I thought of it. The other day, I had a friend who he does pop-up restaurants. So, like as a way of saying, like, why does the community gathering for meals have to happen in environments where you're separated by essentially who can afford what at restaurants? So in Hermosa, he did a pop-up restaurant, and he went to the farmer's market, got all the food. One of his friends that was a chef made this big meal, and he just put make your reservations, for the meal, and people paid whatever they wanted. But then right there, you're having this excellent food, meal. Neighbors are seeing each other. There are giant long tables, so you just sat down wherever there was space. And it was an excellent meal, but it was a pop-up meal, because it insisted that this meal was going to be had not on the terms, that we normally gather around tables, be it separated from others in our home or separated by economy, in our restaurants. And I thought, well, what if theology, the micro-theologies, are like this? They're like pop-up theologies, little doxological protest inspired by this prophetic Jewish dude who we all got really into. And in the act of doing the theology is like, is simultaneously constructive, but it's also deconstructive, because it insists that what we're doing when we do theology isn't what they're doing at McDonald's or at the expensive steakhouse kind of thing.
Well, hallelujah. And yes, Tripp, I think you'll have to do a whole riff on, pop-up theology, pop-up communion. That is a beautiful new metaphor, parable for commensality, for the primal eating together. That's what that body of Christ is supposed to be all about, really, really being members of one another, but not in some tired corporate sense of the corporeality of Jesus, but really in this nourishing, egalitarian, participatory sense. I love it. But the pop-up has the character of the event.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So the last question that I had is the 2 days before the Unfolding Theology, Constructive Interactive Theology workshop, we're spending 2 days with Jack Caputo. And we're calling it the theological pregame. But so tell us, as someone who is friends with Jack and Phil, constructive theologians, deconstructive ones, and all the things that get unfolded in between. What would be your advice as a teacher as to how to hear these two conversations next to each other and benefit from both?
Aside from really recommending moments of silence and deep breathing, that allow careful listening, right? These are going to be very, I think, congenial conversations. The genius that you're staging there, but I think that Phil will help people to push Jack firmly on this question of existence. Getting a lot of mileage from God insisting but not existing, and yet he claims several times in the same book that God insists upon existing, and he's wanting to say that's through our actions and embodiment. So I think that Phil's metaphysical mind can push against some of the anti-metaphysics and the anti-realism that Jack could seem to effect at times, and that could seem to allow one to get a little trapped in a static contradiction there. I mean, if God insists upon existing, I'd let her. And I think that Phil, who is much less coy about the hermeneutics at play, Jack is now open to a hermeneutical ontology, and that's very helpful for this negotiation. But metaphysics remains a bugbear, and I think that the way that Phil can move into a straightforwardly and complexly metaphysical language is key here, because it's also fully physical, because it's actually very much rooted in the physicality of physics and biology. And that's a very promising and still underdeveloped part of Jack's recent work, right? He goes into the cosmopoetics. But I really think Philip will have some cool updates on the particular physics in play, and might help to expose actually a much more poetic kind of physics actually already revealing itself just beyond the edges of physics itself than Jack had a chance to get into. Does that help?
Yeah, so, no. I think that's great. The other thing I completely forgot to ask: give us the invitation to the Encounter of Theology and Affect Theory that's coming up at Drew. So if people are listening to this and they say, "Man, I want to check Drew out. I want to see what happens in these interdisciplinary theological conversations," you have the conference coming up.
We have the conference coming up, Affectivity and Divinity, Affect Theories and Theologies. And, it's, as our other ones have been, but perhaps more so, very interdisciplinary. But we have the big heavy thinkers of affect theory who are not religious scholars or theologians interested in coming. Eugene Brinkman, Mel Chen, Patricia Clough, Ann Stekovich. But we have also theological thinkers like Amy Hollywood and Joe Donovan Schaefer coming, who are working already in that interchange. Among those giving main presentations, Tendeko will come, who's just finished a book on affect theory. So this is, you want me to the date I see is March 18th through the 20th. Can we post the link to the website?
Oh yeah. All the information will be up on the blog post for it. And if someone is saying, did she say effect theory? What is affect theory, and why is it theological?
What is it? Well, it's a very interesting line of thinking on feeling, on what is sometimes called emotion, but it is a way now of taking affect seriously, not just for understanding ourselves psychologically better and sexually, erotically, but politically, and perhaps becoming more canny at how we maneuver our ethics in the world, how we create animate, to use Mel Chen's wonderful word, animacies, how we create animacies, animated interconnections that materialize within us and between us by being much more aware of the role of affect. So it's certainly an anti-rationalist line of thinking. And there are forms of it that recognize actually the importance, the ancestry indeed of Whitehead in this, who did think of affect as at the base of things, right? Apprehension is the feeling by which the present feels the past and therefore comes into its own. Apprehension is an affect, and apprehensions are the causal events of the world. So Whitehead was already there with affects, but yes, affects have effects. Affects, in effect, are effects, but the more we become mindful of this pervasiveness of affect, the more effectual we might be, both in leading affects, but also in stirring them, in responding to them, in living them with vibrancy, and also perhaps with transformation. Affect theory plays a big role in relation to queer theory. There's an extensive overlap that's happened, really understanding our erotic embodiment in a much richer, more complex way.
Yeah.
And of course, deep political and theological implications that we're hoping to explore.
All right. Well,
on our poster, you'll see that online. We have a kind of very, very southern desert kind of jumbled bricolage in which God is love is a hand-scrawled sign in the midst of it. Yeah.
All right. Well, all the information for the event will be up on the website, and if I'm talented enough at remembering all the books we just went through, I can put links to those up there as well. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us, Catherine. And I will look forward to seeing you soon at Progressive Youth Ministry.
All right. Most just trip.
This podcast is sponsored by Phillips Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a theological school that offers Christian education in service of intelligent, just, and compassionate religious and civic communities. They welcome students to a safe space for truth-seeking conversation about the Bible, Jesus, and faithful living. They have on-campus and distance learning options. Go check them out at www.wherefaithleads.com.